The palace spires rose above the trees, reflecting sunlight. While the city streets were still empty, the palace itself was bustling with life on the eve of the crown prince's wedding to the marquise's daughter. No servant dared to stay in bed, as everyone needed to contribute to make everything perfect. A ray of sunlight crossed the eyelids of a black-haired girl, making them close tighter, just as a modest question was asked whether the lady had awoken. The brunette opened her emerald eyes and sat up in bed, smiling as she asked her maid if it was time to go to the palace. It was a typical day for an aristocratic lady soon to become empress. A morning bath with rose petals and ladies-in-waiting working on her flawless appearance. However, something was entirely new for the girl who, looking in the mirror, saw not herself and ordinary people nearby, but instead the prince, knights, and mages. And where her reflection should have been, the main villain from a novel she had read a few days ago stared back into her eyes. She had become Eris Miserian, the jealous antagonist who wished to destroy the love between her fiancé and a bankrupted count's daughter at any cost, even at the price of her own life. Girls who dream of being in their favorite fairy tales don't understand that happy and just endings don't come for everyone, and they view these fictional worlds through rose-colored glasses. The current occupant of Eris Miserian's body had a completely different opinion on this matter. She would never love this world. The same soft voice that had spoken to her that morning tried to discern the thoughts of the future empress. Eris simply waved it off, mentioning the slow passage of time and possible thoughts about the wedding. But in her head, a plan was forming. How to return to her own world as quickly as possible without living out the pre-written story of the heroine. Perhaps by ending her life sooner than planned. Thanks to the book, Eris already knew that the crown prince loves not her, but the impoverished count's daughter, Helen. She will become the empress, and Alec will do everything possible to make that happen. Driven mad by envy, the original bride will poison Helen, restoring justice. The one who desperately desired justice and the return of what was taken from her will receive the death penalty, while the prince's beloved will return to life, receiving her happy ending. Though for the current Eris, that would be a good ending if it allows her to return to her own world. After the hunt, the crown prince awaits his future empress, and Eris. She began to descend to the table, where she was met with Alec's indifferent eyes and Helen's friendly smile, who instinctively called her by name before correcting herself to Lady Miserian. The brunette politely smiled, unlike the original Eris, and adjusted her voluminous red dress. The irritated prince sighed, noting her tardiness. Apologizing, the bride took her seat across from the pair. The tea hadn't even had time to cool, much to the relief of the ash-haired commoner beloved by Alec. The prince took note of the formal address to Miserian, disapproving of it and reminding everyone that they are all friends here. Contrary to being rude and leaving the tea, Lady Miserian considered it unnecessary and asked Helen to pour her some tea. The prince sarcastically commented on the bride's lack of independence and hand issues, which he parried with his recent friends comment and etiquette rules, visibly angering the groom. However, the radiance, non-confrontation, and innocence of Helen saved them from a full-blown argument, as these were the beloved traits of readers. Behind them they were embraced by Jason Kajar, the Duke's son and the prince's longtime friend, hopelessly in love with the ash-haired beauty. The red-haired knight later greeted Eris as well, complimenting her beauty. Miserian wished Mr. Kajar a dazzling day, to which he became flustered, thinking he didn't deserve such praise without a heroic deed. The girl, with a barely noticeable smirk, emphasized that the crown prince's bride should speak no less. The groom clenched his jaw, glaring at her for such talk in front of his beloved. His old friend noticed this and reminded him that such behavior was inappropriate in public. Alec justified it by saying he didn't need to care about others' opinions, but Miserian didn't back down and reminded him of the lack of an imperial status. Even the quiet Helen was surprised and tried to calm Eris, disapprovingly calling her name. Everyone sat apart, but together, looking at the brunette with bewilderment and condemnation. Despite being their childhood friend, each addressed her as a stranger. Feeling the pain and offense of this treatment, Lady Miserian was driven to a terrible sin in an attempt to restore justice. But how will the third party in the body of the rejected villain behave? Elise rose from the table, bowing slightly forward in respect and thanking Entoblum for pouring the tea. Helen doubtfully addressed Miserian by name, wondering what was wrong. Why was she leaving? The lady sharply reacted to the Count's daughter's lack of understanding of titles and others' views, reminding her of the obligation to observe etiquette at court and address His and Her Highness according to their status. Entoblum, ashamed, lowered her gaze, unable to respond, and the Crown Prince defended her, slamming his fist on the table. With a question about how Miserian dared to criticize Helen in his presence, he was about to stand up, but the ash-haired woman grabbed the prince's hand. Alec wanted to object to her in bewilderment, but Entoblum declared that she was fine. The villain smirked as she observed the innocence of the heroine's kind and forgiving soul, unaware of how everyone was ready to give their lives for her smile. Therefore, Elise left without saying another word, deciding that there should be at least one exception to the rules. On a hot, sunny day, it was particularly uncomfortable with makeup and heavy, unfamiliar jewelry. Moreover, those that would never suit her true nature. However, Elise thought the weather was sunny and beautiful. So when the coachman asked if she had a good time, she, albeit with a slight delay, answered positively and ordered to drive home. As the lady had already noted, the weather was wonderful for another attempt to end life and return to her own. However, it didn't happen. After many attempted methods, her plan wasn't succeeding. From her very first day in the novel, the desire to return was stronger than fear. Neither the height of the balcony, nor the vial of poison, nor even the sharp dagger could help the poor lady return to her body. As if the world itself couldn't let her go or change poor Elise's fate, or didn't want to. In the first case, she would be caught by the horsekeeper, who assumed it was an unsuccessful attempt to get some air. In the second, the lethal liquid turned out to be just a strong sleeping potion, and in the case of what seemed the most reliable method, thanks to the doctor, there were no serious health problems. Just servants were alarmed, not understanding who could have attacked their mistress. Absolutely nothing allowed her to even progress with leaving the novel. She was locked up like a bird in a cage, amusing everyone around with desperate and pitiful attempts to fly away. Only one idea remained viable that could help her, and if it worked, she wouldn't be alone. Miserian asked her maid, Emma, to find a powerful fortune teller, strictly ordering her to do it so that not a single soul would know. If the world uses supernatural forces to restrain her, why shouldn't she do the same for a fair game? Preparing for the fateful meeting with her only chance of salvation, the girl decided to dress lighter, compensating for the heavy mourning. However, the servants insisted that their mistress always look perfect, even on a light walk. Perhaps she should clear her mind and pick more suitable jewelry, dresses. The maids even recommended a shop where Elise could enjoy a delicious dessert, though perhaps they were trying to ask for cookies for themselves this way, but, in any case, it worked. However, to maintain Miserian's image, the girl threatened that if she didn't like the sweets, she wouldn't bring them any and would scold everyone. In reality, she was amazed by the servants' devotion and love for their mistress, and strongly doubted whether they received even a fraction of a percent from her in return. Probably this world was closer to modern. The gatekeepers and guards on the streets had pistols. Lamps powered by magical engineering were shining, which was quite ironic, as the mages themselves were expelled, but their technologies were quite extensively used. When the coachman and guard announced they had arrived, she got out and waved them off, saying she wanted to walk alone. At their attempt to convince the mistress otherwise, justifying it with what the young man considered a recent attack on the lady, Miserian irritably told them to return, making it clear she wouldn't repeat twice. The guard looked around in confusion. The street was empty. Giving up, he said he would stay in the vicinity and pick her up, which Elise agreed to. Arriving at the address of her salvation, she stepped onto the creaking floor of the wooden shack. The room looked unusual but cozy. Large bookcases full of books, tables covered with numerous candles, exhibits behind locked glass, a pedestal with an open book, and the next room was hung with red curtains and a blue curtain of large beads, hiding it from prying eyes. A slightly tart but pleasant smell came from small cauldrons and liquid distillation devices. Doubts were fading. Was this really a fortune-teller's place? Though perhaps all these strange objects were for show and to attract clients. Elise reached for the book to familiarize herself with it, but a velvety, mysterious voice advised against doing so. From the mysterious room emerged an equally mysterious girl with sapphire eyes, which were emphasized by an amulet with a sky-blue gemstone and pleasantly contrasted with the amber-red, lush strands on her face. The dark blue dress accentuated her figure, and a shawl covered her shoulders. Elise pulled back her hand and turned to the stranger, and after a second got down to business, deciding to test the fortune-teller with a simple question. Did she know why she needed to seek such services? The fortune-teller answered affirmatively without changing expression, even mentioning her surname, which in fact didn't inspire much confidence, as many knew about the Crown Prince's bride. However, when, with an interested look, she raised an eyebrow and called Elise an unfortunate stranger, things became much more interesting. The lady was stunned, clearly unprepared to hear such things right away. The fortune-teller didn't waste any time and grabbed the girl's hand, ordering her to follow while ignoring Alice's uncertainty. The room behind the curtain was just as peculiar as the previous one, with dried herbs, vessels, and bottles containing unknown substances. The stranger, now deeply focused on questioning the red-haired lady, emphasized her hope that the fortune-teller already knew everything, which would make the task easier, to help her return. Unfortunately, the fortune-teller stated that her wish wasn't as easily fulfilled as she hoped, reminding her of past, seemingly radical attempts that had failed, which she learned about through her soul scent. Even after asking again, the stranger didn't get a more detailed answer, only an explanation that the attempt failed because of trying to tear her soul apart by herself. Now Alice was certain these words weren't just guesswork. The fortune-teller asked her to wait, then began sorting through bottles and mixing liquids in a boiling pot. Afterward, under her guest's silent, questioning gaze, she poured the mixture into a bowl. Miserian looked with disgust at the offered bowl, which she was supposed to drink from. When she asked if the potion maker knew what it was, she joked that it didn't matter, and wouldn't it be good even if it might be poison? After hesitating and examining the liquid suspiciously, Alice risked following the fortune-teller's request and emptied the bowl completely, but immediately regretted her decision. The horrible taste burned her mouth, and she was suddenly overwhelmed by nausea. The fortune-teller quickly offered her guest some jelly, which she said would help with the unpleasant side effects. The stranger was suspicious of this, remembering the carrot and stick method. Finally, the fortune-teller sat opposite her, smoothly getting to the point, and mentioning that she wasn't an ordinary fortune-teller. When Miserian raised her eyebrow, she snapped her fingers, and immediately a blue, mesmerizing flame appeared in her palm. Bringing it closer to Alice, the stranger finally decided to introduce herself as Medea, the last witch in these lands. The stranger was shocked. There hadn't been any mention of witches in the novel. Medea, noticing the girl's confusion, suggested she had many questions in her head, but couldn't promise to answer everything. First, Alice asked why she was the last one, to which she received the obvious answer: everyone had fled this empire for their own safety, those who survived. Delving into witch history, the fortune-teller shared that despite having names, none had surnames because they don't have offspring. It happens, but very rarely, as witches value individuality and freedom more. As a sign of respect, they address each other only by first names and consider themselves sisters. Alice wanted to clarify many things about this world's unexplored territory, but it was more important to ask the main question. Was there any way for her to return to her world? The witch slightly raised the corner of her mouth, obviously expecting this question. The answer was that the sisters could save her, but for a good price, the willingness to experience death again, which Alice had already tried to achieve before. However, Medea would need to contact other witches for permission with such a unique case. Miserian, without thinking about the need to decide on this frightening trial, only asked when everything would be ready for her return. The fortune teller, after thinking, stated a time frame of 2 weeks, assuming urgency, and hoped for the lady's understanding, since gathering responses from all continents, where the sisters had settled, would take more than a day. But doubt crept into the stranger, and she uncertainly asked the only person she could voice it to, nervously gripping her dress fabric. What would happen if she couldn't overcome her fear of death, if she didn't want to feel it again? Unfortunately, no clear or encouraging answer followed, only sympathy and an explanation that magic, unlike priests' theology, doesn't always serve good purposes. Therefore, if she believed in miracles, she should go to a temple, though without guarantee that this would be the true, necessary, or even possible path for her. The lady stood up, stating she understood her words, and placed a pouch with jingling contents on the table. Although the fortune teller said the stranger didn't need to pay for the service, Alice insisted, saying it was for her comfort. After all, it was a kind of guarantee they would keep each other's secrets, since Medea had a much more terrible secret if it fell into the wrong hands. Understanding her position, the fortune teller took the money pouch, saying she would accept the price of her own life. She also advised keeping a mirror nearby in case Medea needed to contact the stranger. On the way back to the shop, her head was filled with many thoughts. This was the first completely new character or villain in this world. How many more would she meet during her 2 weeks of survival here? She would probably have to find answers to questions only with time, and thinking about the usefulness of acquaintances now was pointless. Coming out of her thoughtful state, Miserian noticed that the street was too crowded today, and the reason was that same cookie shop the maids had talked about. Deciding this wouldn't do, and having no particular desire to stand in a huge line for cookies, the girl turned around, deciding to come back another day. But almost immediately after she turned, she was pushed by a hurrying person so hard that the lady stumbled and nearly fell. But someone's strong hands managed to catch her by the shoulders. At the caring question from a dark-skinned, dark-haired young man asking if Alice was all right, she was slightly taken aback. He released her shoulders after making sure she was steady on her feet, emphasizing that she had nearly gotten into trouble. Miserian turned to him, looking closely and confirming that this was Helena's savior, who had prayed for the real Alice to burn in hell's boiling cauldron. High Priest Hybris, not yet knowing that he would soon become the main rival of the novel's primary villain. The future sworn enemies stood in silence for a moment, but suddenly his expression shifted, and in an instant he was leaning over her, studying her intently. Yet Alice held firm against his penetrating gaze, refusing to look away, until his quiet, menacing question, "Who is she?" Her heart faltered. His dark eyes seemed to pierce through her, studying her very essence, burning through her defenses until she could barely breathe. He examined her methodically, as if she were some fascinating tome holding answers he desperately sought. Her mind raced chaotically as she rapidly weighed her options and their consequences, even considering revealing everything and, as Medea had suggested, testing her fortune at the temple. In the novel, Hybris was one of the central characters, the one who resurrects Helena from death, using all sacred powers at his disposal, while fervently praying for Miserian's damnation. He stood as Alice's perfect antithesis, the true hero who had liberated the Empire from its heartless villain. As High Priest, should he discover her true identity, he might subject her to experiments, or worse, inform the Crown Prince, providing yet another reason for mockery, or perhaps even orchestrate her imprisonment in some distant castle. This visitor from another world would never allow such a fate, not when she'd finally made progress towards solving her predicament by consulting the witch. These past 2 weeks would have been better spent avoiding any involvement at all. Believing attack to be the best defense, she frowned and loudly challenged the propriety of a priest being acquainted with an unmarried noblewoman. The young man retreated, protesting that he hadn't been referring to her title, to her obvious demand of what he had meant then. He averted his gaze, now convinced he faced the prince's bride herself, internally questioning what such an esteemed person could be doing among the crowd before a shop. Hesitating and concerned for his reputation, Hybris attempted to guide the lady to a more private location to avoid awkwardness. After all, the Marquise's daughter and future empress was well known, and naturally, her raised voice in conversation with a priest would cause quite a stir. Alice continued pressing him, demanding explanations for his unwarranted questioning. The poor young man recoiled, insisting this was no interrogation, that he would never dare such presumption. But Miserian maintained that his behavior was far from a casual inquiry, as she advanced threateningly toward him. After all, should she act inappropriately toward him, her gender wouldn't excuse such behavior, would it? Finally yielding to her pressure, he admitted his mistake and offered apologies, which Alice accepted, ceasing her offensive and proceeding past him toward her waiting coachman, while the high priest could only watch her departure. During her journey home, the stranger reflected deeply on the encounter, regretting her harsh treatment of Hybris. Should she have confessed? Perhaps this had been her opportunity to establish ties with the temple, should she need to deviate from the original narrative or the witch's method of return. Miserian chided herself for overreacting. The high priest's assistance could have proved valuable. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. To return to her world, one she'd never intended to leave, she must experience death not once, but multiple times. Given the choice between apologizing to a man who despised her and enduring those horrific sensations, Alice would readily choose the former. If only she could remember what was yet to come. All she could do now was pray for another chance encounter with him. The carriage approached the palace under the star-studded dome of night, forcing her to set aside her contemplations. Alice stepped down from the carriage, and her accompanying guard reminded her of the upcoming night's investiture, suggesting she select a personal guardian for her safety. Without her genuine interest, the ceremony would be meaningless, though perhaps she ought to reconsider her stance. Having personal guards wouldn't bind her to any obligations, but would offer convenience in both public affairs and private matters. Miserian pondered this briefly, but, certain of her imminent departure from this realm, declined to surround herself with additional attendants. The knight shrugged, acknowledging he wouldn't contradict her decision, but noted that many would eagerly serve as the lady's personal guard, dedicating their lives to such a beautiful woman. Alice merely smirked, highlighting the foolishness of such romantic notions. His words rang hollow, suggesting beauty alone warranted protection. Moreover, she questioned whether a personal knight was little more than a slave, whose life would be risked in place of her own. Certainly not what this otherworldly visitor desired. After all, she believed the paramount principle was to dedicate one's life to oneself alone, never surrendering control to another. Whether becoming or bearing the responsibility for another's life, both paths led to danger and hardship. The novel's reader strained to recall every detail about Hybris, even such minor facts as his weakness for confectionery. But fear of judgment over a high priest pursuing such frivolous luxuries overwhelmed his desires, forcing him to indulge only in utmost secrecy. Helen had been the first to discover this and, wishing to help, summoned him from the temple simply to share some cookies. She had remembered him while passing the shop, having spotted him in the confectioner's queue. Sweets had always lifted her spirits, as did giving gifts to others, so she reasoned both she and Hybris would find joy in her gesture. The high priest had been profoundly moved by this thoughtful act. Through her kindness, he finally found freedom from his rigid constraints and learned to accept his own preferences. This led to Hybris's first experience of love, tragically unrequited. His uncertain lingering at the shop just yesterday confirmed these events had yet to unfold. If Alice required the high priest's support, she must act decisively before anyone else. Otherwise, she could consider her gambit lost. As a high priest devoted to his principles and character, he would maintain her confidences if asked. Miserian was already strategizing how to outmaneuver Helen. Logic suggested visiting the shop, hoping to catch him again during his sweet-tooth contemplations. Though she hadn't dismissed the possibility of encountering him at the palace and immediately requesting his discretion regarding their future conversation, she worried about unwanted listeners, including the prince himself. He might then report her perceived infidelity to the emperor, triggering consequences she couldn't predict. While this would wound the prince, it served no purpose, as Alice had no intention of disrupting Helen's romantic destiny. Therefore, her mission became clear: locate Hybris at the confectionery. Just as she prepared to depart, a knock at her door inquired whether she had awakened. She learned she must hasten her preparations, as the emperor himself had commanded her presence at the palace today. Alice's brow furrowed with suspicion as she wondered about the summons. What could His Majesty want with her at the palace?